I want to tell you about a photograph. Not a famous one, not one you'd find in a textbook or hanging in a museum. This was a photograph I stumbled across in a digitized newspaper archive at 2 in the morning, 3 years into what I thought was a casual interest in Victorian-era anthropology. A photograph from the 1880s, a group of men standing outside what appears to be a civic building. Broad columns, ornate stonework, the kind of architecture that makes you feel small just looking at it. But it wasn't the building that stopped me, it was the men, or rather what I initially assumed was a trick of perspective. Forced angles, a wide lens, some artifact of early photographic technology that I simply didn't understand. Because these men were large, not unusual large, not big fellow must have played rugby large, I mean genuinely structurally, proportionally large, in a way that made the doorframe behind them look like something built for a different category of human being. I closed the tab, opened it again, closed it. I told myself lens distortion. I told myself short doorframe. I told myself every reasonable thing a reasonable person tells themselves when something doesn't fit. And so I started looking. Really looking. Not at one photograph, but at hundreds. Not in one archive, but in collections across 6 countries. And the deeper I looked, the more the comfortable explanation, distortion, staging, anomaly, began to crack. This is not a story about giants in the mythological sense, at least, not exactly. I want to be clear about that from the beginning. This is a story about something the historical record doesn't fully explain, about accounts, images and references that don't quite fit the version of the past we've been given, about a pattern that shows up in different places and different times but is never directly addressed, about what happens when a simple question keeps coming up and no one seems willing to answer it. Where did the giants go? Here is what the historical record officially tells us about human height in the 19th century. Average height for an American man in 1850 was approximately 5 feet 7 inches. European men were slightly shorter on average. This is documented, this is settled science, and for the most part when you look at photographs from that era, daguerreotypes, wet plate collodions, early albumen prints, the people look like people. Proportionate, recognizable, like us only in worse clothing. But there is a subset of photographs, a specific recurring subset, that doesn't match, not dramatically, not in every frame, but persistently, across decades, across continents, across photographic styles and lighting conditions and supposed contexts, there are images where the human subjects and their surrounding architecture simply do not reconcile. Doorframes, that's where it starts for most people. Doorframes are one of the most stable architectural constants in human construction. They are, almost universally, built to accommodate the tallest expected member of a community, plus clearance. Standard Victorian-era door height in England was around 6 feet 8 inches. In the United States, similar. Yet in photograph after photograph from this period, you will find men, not one man, groups of men, sometimes uniformed men, sometimes civic officials standing in doorways and barely needing to duck. This raises a simple but critical question. Who were these door frames built for? The official explanation is lens distortion, staging, and the tendency of photographers to select unusually large subjects for novelty portraits. And that explanation is fine, as far as it goes. Except it doesn't account for scale consistency within the same image. It doesn't account for the shadows. Shadows don't distort with a lens the same way foreground subjects do. And in several of these photographs, the shadows of these figures extend in ways that are geometrically inconsistent with any known optical artifact. The official explanation breaks here. Not completely, not irreparably, but it develops cracks. And once you see the cracks, you can't unsee them. In 1833, soldiers digging at Lompoc Ranch in California reportedly unearthed a skeleton measuring nearly 12 feet in height. The account appeared in multiple local papers of the time, and then it disappeared from the record. In 1912, the New York Times, not a fringe publication, not a pamphlet, not a conspiracy broadsheet, but the newspaper of record, published an account of the discovery of 18 skeletons in Lake Delavan, Wisconsin. The remains were described as belonging to individuals of unusual height and with anatomical features that distinguish them from modern human remains. The Smithsonian Institution was notified. A team was dispatched, and then silence. Not a follow-up, not a debunking, not an official statement of any kind, just silence. The kind of silence that falls not when something is proven wrong, but when something is quietly set aside. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. 1891, Crittenden, Arizona, giant remains, newspaper reports, Smithsonian involvement rumored, no official record. 1880s, Cayuga Township, Ohio. Multiple accounts of enormous skeletal remains discovered during excavation. Local newspaper coverage. Then nothing. County after county. Decade after decade. Account after account, each one surfacing briefly in local papers before vanishing from the official record entirely. Not disproven, not investigated publicly. Just gone. Now, I want to be careful here. I'm not asking you to simply believe every 19th century newspaper account you encounter. Newspaper editors of that era were not above sensationalism. Hoaxes existed. P.T. Barnum built an empire on the willingness of Americans to believe extraordinary things. But here's the strangest part. The sheer volume of these accounts, the geographic spread, the consistency of certain details, the height ranges, the specific anatomical descriptions, the institutional involvement that then goes silent, this is not what a collection of isolated hoaxes looks like. Hoaxes cluster around specific showmen and specific moments. They get debunked. They generate counter-coverage. These accounts don't get debunked. They get ignored. And that, in its own way, is more troubling than a debunking would be. The silence was deafening. I want to leave the bones for a moment, because the bones ultimately are only part of this. Let's talk about the buildings. Specifically, let's talk about a very specific architectural era, roughly 1750 to 1900, and the extraordinary uniformity of civic construction across that period. Not similarity, uniformity, a consistency of design language, structural proportion, and ornamental vocabulary that appears with startling regularity in cities that had no meaningful communication with each other, under governments with no political alignment, using builders with no shared training, the columned facade, the vast central atrium, the ceilings, and this is where I want you to stop and think, the ceilings. Look at the ceilings of 19th century civic buildings, not the decorative plasterwork, though that's extraordinary in its own right. Look at the height, the functional height, the distance from the floor to the ceiling in the lobbies, the corridors, the halls of these buildings. We are talking routinely about ceiling heights of 20, 25, 30 feet in spaces that serve purely administrative functions, spaces where clerks worked at desks, where officials processed paperwork, where, functionally, a 12-foot ceiling would have served every known human need of the period. So why are they 30 feet tall? The official answer is prestige. Civic architecture is intended to project power and permanence. Tall ceilings communicate importance. This is a real and documented architectural philosophy. But the official explanation breaks here too, because prestige architecture scales its grandeur toward its visitors. A space designed to impress a human being standing at 5 feet 7 inches tall doesn't need 30-foot ceilings. It needs columns that dwarf that person, yes, but the functional spaces, the interior corridors, the private offices, the working rooms behind the grand facade, those are scaled to the users. Unless the users were a different scale than we are. The deeper I looked, the more this question refused to go away. If you've made it this far, you're asking the same questions I was. Stay with me, because what comes next is where this stops being a collection of anomalies and starts looking like something else entirely. Here is what I keep returning to. Here is the question that for me collapses every comfortable explanation I've been offered. Look at the geographic spread of this architectural style. I've mentioned Washington, Paris, St. Petersburg, but let's be more thorough. Bombay, now Mumbai, 1893. The Municipal Corporation building rises in a Gothic Renaissance hybrid style that mirrors civic buildings in Bristol, England. Same proportions, same ceiling heights, same door frames built for a larger occupant than the documented population. Montevideo, Uruguay, 1906. The Legislative Palace, begun under a government with no meaningful architectural exchange with Europe, somehow arrives at ceiling heights and door proportions indistinguishable from their counterparts in Vienna or Edinburgh, Melbourne, Australia, Sydney, Cape Town, Montreal, Buenos Aires, St. Louis. All across the so-called building boom of the late 19th century, something extraordinary happened. Cities that were, in some cases, barely a generation old, on continents separated by oceans, under governments separated by ideology, somehow produced civic buildings of near identical internal proportion. Not stylistically similar, proportionally identical. This raises a simple but critical question. How, not why, not when, not under which political philosophy or in service of which empire? Those questions have answers, however incomplete. No, how? How do builders in Uruguay and builders in Melbourne in the same decade, without satellite communication, without standardized international building codes, without any documented exchange of architectural blueprints, how do they arrive at door frames of the same height, corridors of the same width, load-bearing walls of the same thickness? The evidence suggests something much larger is at work here. Either there was a world-spanning coordinating body so powerful, so pervasive, and so thoroughly erased from the historical record that not a single document of its influence has survived, or these buildings were not all built in the late 19th century. What if some of them were found? I want to introduce a framework here. Not as truth, not as conclusion, but as a lens through which certain anomalies become, if not explained, at least legible. What if the late 19th century was not primarily an era of construction, but an era of occupation? What if the populations that we call Victorian, that we frame as the builders of the modern world, were in many cases moving into a built environment that was already there, already standing, already scaled to a population that was no longer present? This is not, on its face, an absurd question. Civilizations have occupied the ruins of prior civilizations throughout all of recorded history. Rome was built on older Rome. Istanbul was built on Constantinople, which was built on Byzantium, which was built on a settlement older still. We know this, we acknowledge this, we teach it. So why is the same analytical framework considered impossible when applied to the 19th century? The official answer is because we have documentation. We have records of these buildings being constructed. We have invoices, architectural plans, newspaper announcements of cornerstone laying ceremonies. And here is where I have to ask you to think carefully about what documentation actually proves. Documentation proves that documentation was created. It tells us who claimed credit for something. It does not always tell us what actually happened, particularly in an era when the entities creating that documentation had both the motive and the means to shape the historical record to their advantage. What documentation do we have for the workforce that built these buildings? Not the architects, not the civic officials, the workers. The thousands upon thousands of labourers who would have been required to quarry, transport and assemble the stone in structures of this scale in the time frames officially attributed to them? In many cases, almost none. In some cases, none at all. Up to this point, I've been careful to stay within the territory of documented anomaly, photographs that don't reconcile, newspaper accounts that vanish, architecture that defies the coordination logic of its era. But the deeper I went, the harder it became to ignore a specific thread. On maps from the 16th, 17th, and well into the 18th century, there exists a territory of extraordinary size, called, in various cartographic traditions, Tartaria, or Grand Tartary, or Tartaria Magna. By some maps, it encompasses virtually all of Central Asia, Siberia, parts of China, and extends westward into Eastern Europe. It is not a small notation. It is not a cartographic placeholder for unexplored wilderness. It is labelled, bounded, given internal subdivisions: Chinese Tartary, Independent Tartary, Muscovite Tartary. It appears on maps published in London, Paris, Amsterdam, Lisbon. It is treated cartographically as a known and significant geopolitical entity. And then, in the 19th century, it is simply no longer there. Not conquered and renamed, not gradually absorbed into surrounding powers with documentation of that process, not debated in the historical literature of the period, just absent, as though the cartographers of 1800 collectively decided that the enormous territory their predecessors had been labelling for 2 centuries had never existed and need not be accounted for. This raises a simple but critical question. What was Tartaria? The official historical position is that Tartaria was never a unified political entity, merely a geographic label applied loosely to the lands of various Turkic and Mongol peoples, a cartographic convention rather than a kingdom or empire. This is a defensible position. Historians make this argument. It has merit. But if Tartaria was merely a geographic convention, a loose label for the place where the steppe peoples live, why does it appear on maps with such specificity? Why are its internal divisions labelled with the precision of a political geographer rather than the vagueness of an explorer gesturing at an unknown interior? And here's the strangest part. The disappearance of Tartaria from the cartographic record coincides with uncomfortable precision with the appearance of that extraordinary 19th century building boom. The same decades in which cities across the world suddenly acquire vast, imposing, curiously oversized civic infrastructure are the same decades in which the maps stop acknowledging a civilization that, by the evidence of those same maps, had occupied a significant portion of the Earth's surface. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. What if the buildings were not built to impress a new population, but inherited from a civilization that was being quietly, systematically, and almost completely written out of the record? The pattern repeats with unsettling precision, and the pattern, once you've seen it in enough places, begins to look less like coincidence and more like method. Consider what a systematic erasure of a prior civilization would actually require. Not war, not necessarily. War leaves ruins, and ruins are archaeological evidence. What it would require is something more subtle. A reframing, a retroactive claim of authorship, a papering over of the existing record with new documentation that explains the physical evidence in terms of the new narrative. The buildings existed, they could not be made to disappear. So instead they are given new histories, new cornerstone dates, new architects, new commissioning governments, and the people who might remember otherwise, or who carry in their very bodies the physical evidence of a different scale of human being, those people are absorbed, reclassified, or simply not discussed. The giant skeleton accounts appear in newspapers for a few years, local papers, regional papers, papers read by people who might still have living memory of the original landscape, and then they vanish. Not because they were disproven, because the institutional machinery for managing the record had by then gotten its hands on the process. The Smithsonian is not villainous in this reading. I want to be careful about that. The evidence suggests not a conspiracy of evil, but something more mundane and in some ways more unsettling. The ordinary human instinct to make the world make sense within the framework one has been given, to classify the anomalous, to store the inexplicable, to, in the process of organizing the record, quietly remove from the accessible record anything that the organizing framework cannot accommodate. The silence was not planned. The silence was structural. Here is what I think about, alone in archive rooms at 2 a.m, surrounded by photographs of people who look back at me across a century and a half. What was the scale of what was lost? Not just the beings, if they existed, if the photographs mean what they appear to mean. Not just the civilization, if Tartaria was something more than a cartographic convention, if those maps were recording something real. But the knowledge. Whatever civilization scaled those buildings, whatever hands quarried and placed that stone, whatever minds designed those proportions, whatever culture decided that this was how a doorframe should be sized, and this was how high a corridor ceiling should stand, that civilization knew something. Had solved problems we are still pretending were solved in the 19th century by men with horses and hand tools and no electricity. And that knowledge is gone. Or not gone exactly. Unattributed. Floating free of its origins, absorbed into the narrative of the inheriting civilization without acknowledgement, without credit, without the philosophical and historical context that might allow us to understand what we're actually standing inside when we walk through one of these buildings. The evidence suggests something much larger than we've been told, not necessarily in any single dramatic revelation, but in the slow accumulated weight of anomaly upon anomaly, photograph upon photograph, skeleton account upon skeleton account, doorframe upon doorframe built for a hand that no longer reaches for it. I started with a photograph. I still don't know what it shows. I mean that literally. After 3 years of looking, of reading, of walking through buildings that seem built for a different world, of chasing newspaper accounts into silence and maps into absence, I do not have a confident answer to the question that photograph first asked me. Were there people in the not-so-distant past built at a scale our history doesn't account for? Was there a civilization vast enough to build across continents in a unified architectural language, sophisticated enough to leave buildings still standing after whatever ended them, and vulnerable enough, or inconvenient enough, to be written almost completely out of the record? I don't know. What I know is this. The official explanation, the one that tells us all these buildings were built in a 50-year frenzy of civic ambition by populations using hand tools and horse carts, that the photographs are lens distortion, that the skeleton accounts are hoaxes, that Tartaria was just a word cartographers used for over there somewhere. That explanation requires me to believe in a set of coincidences so extensive and so precisely patterned that believing in them feels itself like an act of faith. Not knowledge, not empiricism, faith, and I find myself less and less willing to extend that faith without better answers. The buildings are still there. Walk through them sometime. Feel the ceiling above you. Look at the door frames. Ask yourself who exactly they were built for. Ask yourself what it would take to coordinate their construction across a dozen continents in a pre-telecommunications world. Ask yourself why, on every map for 2 centuries, there was a civilization labelled in the territory between Europe and China, a civilization that received ambassadors and issued geographic subdivisions, and then one day simply wasn't. Ask yourself where the giants went, not why they left, not when they disappeared, not under what circumstances the world stopped seeing them and started pretending they had never been here. Just where. Because someone built those rooms, someone opened those doors, someone stood in those photographs looking back at us with faces that seem, across the century and a half between us to be waiting for us to ask the right question? I'm still asking.